Hello and welcome to this new interview with Adnkronos. I'm Giorgio Rutelli, and joining us today is Evan Smith, co-founder and CEO of Altana, a leading company in AI-driven solutions for global supply chain visibility. So Evan has some really great insights and insightful analysis of the shifting dynamics of globalization. And now he's working with businesses and policymakers to help them navigate this complex moment in time. I also had the opportunity to see how Altana works, and it was quite impressive. The depth of their data set and the variables that you can input into this app is quite amazing. So we're going to talk with Evan. We're going to start from the big issue that is concerning a lot of us in Europe, which is the tariffs that the Trump administration is imposing on the rest of the world. There's a 90-day moment of suspension, but things are shifting, things are changing, and things are definitely changing according to Evan, who is talking about globalization 2.0. From your point of view, has Donald Trump's move already changed the landscape of global trade, and how are companies already redesigning production and supply chains around the world? Thank you, Evan, for being with us.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me and for your kind words on the product. So to your question, yes, the answer is we're already seeing a pretty dramatic shift in the global supply chain network and trade flows. One of those shifts has been underway for a while and has been accelerated through the recent increased tariffs and trade barriers. That is the called friendshoring, reshoring, nearshoring of supply chains, particularly in North America, but you're seeing the same thing in Europe as well. The goal there is to bring back manufacturing into the geographies that are more geopolitically reliable. If there's sort of a geopolitical backdrop to the whole thing, which I'm sure we'll get into. And then in particular to avail themselves of any free trade agreements. And that's, in the United States and North America, that's the USMCA. That was the free trade agreement to replace NAFTA. And what you saw over the last 8 years or so was a shift in the final assembly of goods to Mexico and to a lesser extent, Canada. And you saw similar dynamics playing out in Europe, but mostly with respect to e-commerce. So what you saw was these supply chains kind of approaching the borders of the US and EU as the final market destinations. Now, what's so different about the present circumstances is the tariffs and the trade barriers that have been erected are in a lot of ways designed to close some of the loopholes that were created in that first wave of nearshoring and friendshoring. Specifically, in the e-commerce flows, the low value but high volume shipments, there was a perception that a lot of goods were being entered into the United States and into Europe. There's sort of different policy mechanisms to address both, but where taxes were being avoided, tariffs were being avoided, and a lot of high-risk shipments like fentanyl and other kind of precursor narcotics were being entered into these economies through that low scrutiny and kind of tax-free or tariff-free mode. So that's been closed up over the last couple of months. The second thing is, I'll just stick with the USMCA and North America, because obviously the United States is driving a lot of this volatility. There was a perception and frankly a reality that rather than the USMCA really motivating the end-to-end manufacturing and production within the North American Free Trade Zone, what was happening instead was the value chains of these goods. Say it's a refrigerator. The value chains of these goods were still primarily coming from China, so that the real value creation, the value addition, was happening in China. but the final assembly was happening in Mexico, and they were going from 25% or 10% or whatever the tariff rate was on the particular goods into a 0 or 2% tariff regime, and effectively exploiting the free trade agreement. And so in both cases, you've seen this this very aggressive and disruptive set of trade policies that I think are ultimately designed to correct and shore up those loopholes and sort of unintended consequences of the first round of it's not strictly counter-Chinese, but I think the both in the U.S. and EU, I think both of these economies are grappling with the non-market behavior and the subsidies and just the massive exporting scale of a rising power.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, very interesting for an Italian European audience, because sometimes we do not realize why the US and the Trump administration has been so tough with China, with Canada and Mexico, and being, the main trading partners. And especially when we think about the automotive industry, there's a lot of connection, there's a lot of, codependency, basically. So we were, sometimes maybe baffled by this, but what you're telling us is quite enlightening in the fact that a lot of this free trade agreement has been used to circumvent tariffs and to basically put a stamp of made in Mexico on products that were actually made elsewhere. So this is very interesting. And we have talked about at my news agency in the past about, for instance, the question of Xinjiang, the production of solar panels or cotton that was sourced from this region in China, in which the Uyghur population is being basically, mistreated, at least we can say this, by the Chinese government. And there's this law on forced labor that basically already created some barriers in the past, and this is something that also Europe has been dealing with. So what I'm asking you now is, we are now talking of a new era of globalization in which you not only talk about what's most convenient, what's cheaper, but you also look at other principles, and the principle of security, resilience, maybe values even. How are these forces driving this shift? Can we actually talk of a new normal in which we need to take into account variables that are not basic economic principle, but they are concerning different aspects of political, sensitivity?
You said it very well. The globalization from 1945 until maybe 2018 was really motivated by efficiency seeking, and therefore outsourcing and extending these value chains of manufacturing in particular to the lowest cost labor and lowest cost manufacturing environments, often at the expense of people and the environment. And then, as we've learned over the last decade or so, at the expense of our economic security and in some cases our national security. So the backlash, I think, is showing up primarily from a regulatory and policy standpoint. I view the European Green Deal through this lens, right? So this is a ESG motivated set of policies. Of course, in the last 6 months, there's been a bit of a clawback and a more modest implementation of those policies, but I think plenty of them will still survive and be implemented. And the goal was to say, look, there's all these environmental externalities and social externalities of these global supply chains. We need to price these in. We need to create a set of market incentives and market requirements to level the playing field. In other words, European industry is being negatively impacted, and European economies are being negatively impacted through the lower cost and unfair practices of countries and production where these standards are not being met. So let's level the playing field. You mentioned the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States. That had a profound effect. The policy design of the UFLPA was around this notion of what's called a rebuttable presumption. So what this is actually very novel and provocative. They said every physical item emanating from Xinjiang province is presumed to be made with forced labor, and you, the private sector, have to trace your value chains to the cotton, to the aluminum, to the polysilicon, and prove that it doesn't come from Xinjiang, or if it does, that forced labor was not employed in the production of those raw materials. And of course, that's next to impossible, right? You can't send auditors into China. They banned that. So it's had the effect of compelling any company that's importing into the United States and wants access to the United States market. They're compelled now to trace their upstream value chains and really show that they're not connected to Xinjiang, and if they are, to remediate that and change it. So there's been over the last 4 years, there's been a major shift in the makeup of these value chains. And as you mentioned, Europe is now, as part of the Green Deal, Europe has its own Forced Labor Prevention Act, and they are in the process of rolling out the implementation of that. It'll go to the member states, and we'll figure out the timing and the exact form of the implementation. But one of the issues with the United States creating this very strong barrier on this social issue in a global supply chain network, okay, maybe those goods instead start to find their way to European markets. You can't get into the United States, so we're going to route them to Europe. So there's this, it's interesting as you kind of see the network respond, barriers here, whether they're environmental or national security or economic security, they shift the flows of goods, and then it almost compels other countries to respond in kind.
So you talked about Europe and the fact that it's the situation is moving, and that Europe is now in a situation in which we are a little bit the weak link of this global supply chain, because of course the US and China have their strengths, they have their markets that are already quite resilient, but at the same time Europe is still a big market for American companies, for Chinese companies. So what can our role be? We often think of our role as, the legislator, the regulator, and this is quite sad in my view, because we limit ourselves to being the referee of a game that we are not playing. So, but at the same time, is there still a strength in Europe that can be used as a leverage in this new globalized 2.0 world?
I think so. And politics aside, what you have seen in Europe from, call it 2000, 2005 was real parity with the United States in terms of GDP, near parity in terms of GDP per capita. And over the last 25 years, you've seen these very different trajectories where a lot of the productivity growth and GDP growth and GDP per capita growth, therefore, are coming in the United States, but not so much in Europe. So, as you know, Europe is going through political and regulatory soul searching right now to say, okay, what about our regulation? What about our market environment is creating that difference in growth trajectory and growth outcome? Some of it's demographic, some of it's regulatory, but so those things aside, I think Europe's going to have to go out with that and really decide. As a unified market and as a potentially regulatory or political superstructure, how it's going to govern itself. So your question is, can Europe sort of achieve economic security? Can it achieve peer status with the US and China as the supply chain and the kind of geopolitical landscape is fragmenting? I think so, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily in its best interests. Meaning, my view is that the US and China are on a path toward near total dislocation and decoupling. The the trade war this morning, there's a headline, Trump's going to potentially soften the trade war. We're going to get to the bargaining table. I tend to view this as more of the gears of history are turning, and the people in charge in both cases are escalatory in nature, and they're both kind of trying to win. But when you have this kind of a great power competition and a disequilibrium in the whole global power balance, this kind of thing tends to happen. So I think the Chinese have accumulated incredible leverage on the world economy through their near monopolies on things like rare earth minerals, critical minerals and magnets. All of the robotics and a lot of the autonomy is predominantly in China. So you kind of go industry by industry by industry and say, like, the Chinese are dominating some of the most important industries, with the exception of AI, and they're not far behind. So given that, and given their desire for regional hegemony, if not global hegemony, there's going to be this decoupling. And so the question, I think, for Europe is, do we want to be a third pole in a multipolar world, or is there a US and Europe closer alignment in the works, where we almost return to the transatlantic alliance? I think that's probably what will and what should happen, just given the nature of the power dynamics and the market power and alliances that need to be brought together to deal with this, very tense and complicated situation with China.
Okay, so you think that Europe is ready to take. I'm not so convinced that Europe is ready.
I wouldn't say they're ready.
But you see basically basically these two big blocks that can become also regional supply chain blocks. I mean, the thing is that in the past, couple of decades, the US has created quite a strong link with countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, South Korea, that in turn became a little bit kind of cushions when you talk about China dominance in the region. So but the US, of course, has now imposed quite high tariffs, at least on paper for the moment, but for instance on Vietnam. And I understand that is a little bit the same question that with Mexico. It's just that China moved some factories basically in Vietnam and just added one more step to the supply chain, and that was it basically for many cases. So, but at the same time, so we are now piercing this veil of hypocrisy that has been with us for a few years. But what I'm curious to see is that is the United States now ready to take on this bigger manufacturing effort, this bigger manufacturing role that can also maybe become a provider of goods to Europe, not only services, because we do know now that there's a big trade imbalance, especially on the goods side. We buy a lot of services from the United States. But so this is a big question, and can then, American production be sufficient to cover what we do not buy anymore from China? That is something that has happened with energy, for instance, and we can talk about that a little later.
Yeah, right. America is now the largest LNG supplier to Europe after Russia. So I think the answer to your question is no. I do not believe that the United States, for a bunch of reasons, is going to be able on its own to be the sort of replacement from a manufacturing base to what China is right now in Europe. I do think, however, that if you think about this as a trusted value chain, right? And when I say value chain, I mean the raw materials through the intermediate components, through the final assembly, and then the distribution to customers. That's that whole value chain network. I tend to see this as inevitably moving toward a trusted value chain network that comprises the United States, Europe, a number of Southeast Asian countries, India, most of Latin America. And that's going to be both, the sort of raw materials, commodities production, you have it all, but for the critical minerals processing and refining, which we can maybe talk more about. But you have it all in these other geographies. You have the various, low to medium to high skilled manufacturing labor and associated cost structures in those geographies. You have the port infrastructure and you have the political relationships. We got to get through this moment in time, but I think that the history is there, the political relationships are there, and I tend to see the inevitability of a trusted value chain, which is not necessarily strictly global, but it's still transnational.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Italy and our sectors of past dominance and now still relevance. Let's call it that way. So, for instance, in these few days back, we started seeing these videos coming on TikTok and on Instagram of luxury products being made in China, and Chinese TikTok, of course, was flooded with it. And basically, they were telling Western audiences, hey, it's us who can make your luxury products. We can make it for much less money. Come buy them from us. So how is high-end European, how are our high-end European brands going to be able to, navigate these disruptions, this, fragmentation? Because it's true that many of these luxury companies have sourced their material from China. And maybe the same thing can be said with the automotive industry, in which the supply chain is very different. But of course, Europe is waking up from the fever dream in which we thought that we could sell stuff to the Chinese market. And this is especially from Germany's point of view. And now they're realizing that the Chinese, as soon as they learn how to make good EVs, and most of them are better than their European counterparts now, so they are not going to buy Mercedes or BMW, etc. So we have these two big, pride sectors, luxury on one side and automotive on the other side, that are struggling right now. And so how do you see these shifts, especially from your point of view of a company that can see all these dynamics and the logistics of two very important sectors for our economy?
Well, look, the reason that we have these big imbalances are twofold. One is the Chinese, for the last 25 years, have been aggressively subsidizing and engaging in non-market behavior, frankly, illegal under the WTO behavior, to favor their industries and to build up this export dominance in the industries of priority. And they went from kind of low and medium value manufacturing to high-end manufacturing. And now, if you read their 5-year economic plans, they're very literal and clear about their intentions, right? They want to be the world leader and frankly dominate not just the manufacturing, but also the R&D and the technology ownership associated now with quantum computing, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology. They've already achieved their goals in solar and batteries and the last 5-year economic plan. So the point then is that Europe must contend with the fact that for 2 decades, China has been allowed to create this unfair structural advantage in these supply chains. That's the first point. Second point is in Europe and the United States, our CEOs and our boards are motivated by the near-term movement in stock price. So there's a sort of built-in structural incentive to be short-termist. And of course, that led to a rapid outsourcing. And so, Europe has had this incredible supply chain for precision manufacturing, this incredible supply chain for automotive, as you said, for apparel and shoes. And a lot of that over the last 25 years and 10 years in particular has shifted over even among the luxury brands. I mean, I actually spent some time in the textile and apparel supply chain in a past life. And I remember 10 years ago, some of the high-end brands were still manufacturing in Portugal and still manufacturing in Italy. And most of that's now gone. So the point is that there were financially motivated, conscious decisions to outsource production, and that created a lot of near-term wealth at the expense of this long-term wealth and long-term economic security. So what does that all add up to? I think it all adds up to Europe is going to have to contend with the unfair practices of China in order to sort of reach a new equilibrium and rectify some of those imbalances. That's what the United States is doing. And I'll put it this way, if the United States is putting these massive tariffs on China, where do you think those Chinese exports are going to go?
Yeah, there's this big,
Europe.
Yeah.
And so it almost forces the hand of Europe to say, all right, we have to sort of align our trade policies toward those of the United States and contend with this as a bloc. Right? If you're going to abuse the system, if we're going to be open trade and free trade and play by the rules, and you're not, well, here we are, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And basically, it's the end of the WTO system, which probably already has been dying for a few years. There's a big problem with the appellate body, but we don't have to go into that discussion, but it's something that, again, it's been discussed in Italy. We do all realize now that what happened in 2001 with the entry of China has actually changed the course of time and the course of history in terms of economic security and supply chains. So let me ask you about your company and how you are incorporating AI in your daily work. I know from what I've seen, on a demo of your application that, I mean, the complexity and the data that you can manage is quite impressive, and so I'm curious to see how you're going to enhance even more what's your services and putting it at the service of the current situation and the evolving situation that is changing every day, and basically how companies are now able to reassess and redirect basically their supply chains according to this new landscape.
Yeah, so Altana is a network. It's an AI-powered network for managing the world's physical products, and to do that across a value chain. So again, from raw materials to the intermediate components to the finished products. So it's everything from the sourcing to the manufacturing to the movement of all these goods around the world, and the center of our universe is a physical product. So we manage that data, we map that data, we connect data points to reveal the value chain networks and the products that move across the world. The way that we do that is through a very novel federated data and AI architecture. When we started the company in 2018, we said, there ought to be, a big kind of Google Maps style common operating picture for the supply chain network. And if you could architect it so that, if Maersk plugs in, or if, a big retailer plugs in, their data is actually contributing to that visibility and to that intelligence for everybody else, then it becomes a genuine network where, it becomes more valuable and more useful the more people join it. So what we do is we don't pool all the data, because you can't, and especially in a fracturing world, we kind of believe this to be true. I think it's been a good bet. You have GDPR in Europe, you have data sovereignty restrictions with governments. So there's no world where you can kind of combine all this data and do the kind of tech platform thing where it all goes to one place. So we said, let's embrace the sensitive and siloed and fragmented nature of the data, and we'll build a hub and spoke federated data platform. So all of our customers get their own private environment. We bring the platform to their data. We apply artificial intelligence to their data. And from that, we're building this kind of derived and rendered view of all the connections of these physical movements of goods and the companies and locations associated with them. So today we have a map of the world supply chain that's like a living, breathing, dynamic map of the supply chain. And roughly half of that picture of the world is actually coming from the network itself. So in other words, we've exhausted what you can theoretically achieve from publicly available data. We spend millions of dollars to license data sets. And we've doubled that visibility from our customers who join the network and contribute to it. So what this will turn into over time is this near complete view of the world's supply chain network. There's some places like inside of China, for example, that are going to be pretty hard to see visibility into. But so we're now at the place where we think we have roughly half of the world's supply chain connectivity in the platform. And then so the question is like, what do you do with it? And you said, what do you do these days? As you can imagine, tariffs and all these trade barriers are an urgent issue for our customers, both in the public and private sectors. We work with governments to enforce these laws and design these policies. We work with the private sector to navigate through this, and we even actually are connecting them together in some partnerships. So tariffs are, a C-suite and board issue. It's a massive dislocation in the whole global trading system. The costs are adding up to billions. The CapEx decisions, that have to get made quickly. Are we going to rebuild a plant here or there? Are we going to redeploy assets? So this is a little bit technical, but if you look at the shape of all these trade policies and tariff policies, they're actually all designed around the value chains of the goods. So the exceptions or the restrictions or the specific anti-dumping and countervailing duties are all being applied to places in the multi-tier value chain. And the point there is that you can really only navigate through this. You can really only enforce these policies through that multi-tier value chain view of the world that we can provide. So again, like whether it's tariffs or export controls, it's all in that network.
I have seen basically, for instance, in the example that I've seen of your app, it was very interesting the fact that if the app gives you immediately the real percentage of tariff on a particular good, depending on what country this good goes through, what provider, how. So basically, you can basically just flag different voices, different parts of this map, and it adds up, and it can change from 4% to 10% quite quickly. So I mean, this is it's very complex, but at the same time, you made it look easy in this presentation, in this app. But it's true that the variables are so many that you really need to be able to see all the different players, all the different materials, all the different goods that can then be part of the final good. And so this is quite it's a very that's why I called you. That's why I was very fascinated by this, because to have this kind of view, this kind of perspective on what's happening, I think it's really important. And at the same time, it also gives kind of doesn't give you a lot of excuses now, because if you used to be blind on what was your supply chain before, then you could tell to the politician, don't do that, because then who knows what the consequences might be. We can have unintended consequences. This might disrupt entire parts of the economy. I think that now you can design a tariff strategy that can be more precise, more surgical, basically. And so, this is going to be tough. And I don't know, I mean, probably you cannot tell me how much you're now talking with the current administration about how to design this new policy. But at the same time, there's a way to make it more rational, or at least more adherent to your policy strategy. That can be rational or irrational, but at least it can be, how can I say, there's some, coherence that you can apply.
I think you said it very well. This kind of platform makes it possible to design surgical policies on tariffs and trade restrictions that have the intended impact and don't have unintended impacts. So that's what we're really excited about in our work with the government.
Okay. So, Evan, thank you so much for being with us today. We'll, maybe call you back when the 90-day expire.
Yeah, we'll see where we get to in a couple months. This was a really, really great discussion. I appreciate you reaching out, and I'd be happy to do it again. Thank you.